Good afternoon, everyone. Very glad we have a guest speaker for CETOC today, Dr. Zhenhua Chen from Ohio State University. I've been know Dr. Chen for a while. We do very research together, not together, but similar, but also some organizations we've been see each other for like TRB, CSP, and some other things. And so I'm very glad he visited the New Orleans those days, and then willing to come to visit us and give us a talk and one area he has been doing for years, and he has done very incredible research in this area. So I'm a quick introduction, Dr. Chen. Dr. Zhenhua Chen is an associate professor of city and regional planning at the Ohio State University. He has held visiting scholars positions at the University of Cambridge, what's it, Westdata University, and the Asian Development Bank. And currently, he serves as the board member and the conference chair of the International Association for China Planning. His research focuses on infrastructure planning, disaster impact assessment, and resilience. And Dr. Chen has authored 3 books, co-edited 2 volumes, and published around 100 articles in leading journals like Transportation Part A, Transport Review, Environment Research Letters. And then he was linked to the Stanford's 2024 Global Top 2% Scientist list, and ranking 98th in the logistics and the transportation subfield. And his work has been recognized with awards, quite a few research awards and some other prize. And some of those names, it's hard for me, okay, but a lot, okay. His research and insight has been featured in mainstream media, such as the Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, Video Network, and Forbes. And his talk today is about the China's rapid development of high-speed rail, and focus on the planning, strategy, financing, and institutional framework that has enabled its success. I think it's very interesting. He asked me about the topics. The reason I brought this up, he has multiple researches he can talk about. I picked this one for a couple of reasons. One is obviously for CETOC we are more focused on the passenger side of the transportation, but the other one, I think you guys have heard a lot about the passenger train in this region, right? Particularly the new train between Baton Rouge and New Orleans has been talked for decades. And every time that seems is moving a little bit and then stopped. And, we would like to see, the high-speed rail that has been successful in other places around the world and what we can learn, and right. And also, I think that the other part, the New Orleans to Mobile train is more likely going to open. So like, those directly related to our region and our research. So welcome, and it's yours now.
Okay, great. Well, first of all, I want to thank Professor Tian. It's a great invitation, so it's a great honor to be here. This is my first time to come here to New Orleans, and it was quite impressive to see that you have such a great transportation sectors here. This morning, I was also honored to attend this board meetings, and had a chance to discuss with the different transportation stakeholders. And it looks like you guys had a great, bright futures. So today, as Professor Tian mentioned, I'll be sharing with you some of my work with the primary focus on this topics on high-speed rail. Just to give you some background, I actually my background is a little bit interdisciplinary. So I had bachelor's in management, master's in economics, and Ph.D. in public policy. But now you see the topic is really focused on transportation. I study a lot about transportation and regional economic development. The topics basically was motivated due to a lot of the discussion, as you may remember, back into the 2009 when the former President Obama was in office, and he launched the visions called the high-speed rail visions for the U.S. At the same time, and China was also developing a large infrastructure plan, tried to develop a national high-speed rail system. So that was the time I started getting motivated and to really look into this topic, because again, when we're talking about the passenger transport, how can we really provide people with a reliable, efficient, sustainable mode of transportation? And that's become very important topics. Without further ado, let me get into the topics. So here, what I like to share with you, since I guess before that, let me just ask a quick question. How many of you have ride a high-speed rail? Raise up your hand. Okay, we have a few people. Okay. I wanted to share with you because first I wanted to share with you some of the global trend. So you can see that why this is important topics. And secondly, I want to talk specifically using China as an example. Some of you may also know that China actually has now become the leading countries in terms of development of high-speed rail. Okay, so I think some of the experiences or lessons learned could be useful not only for China but also for other countries and even for the U.S. as well. Okay. Anything? Okay. Now the next is I wanted to really focus more specifically on those social economic impacts of the high-speed rail. Okay, because obviously for large infrastructure like the passenger rail development, their impact is going to be very widespread, covering multiple issues, including land use, social equities. I know we have an equity center here with the focuses on the equity side. There's also economic impacts, as well as what will be the appropriate scale given the size of the city and population. So in the end, I'm going to conclude with some lessons learned. So feel free to interrupt me if you have any questions or things that are unclear. All right, so to start with this topics, first of all, so as I mentioned, this high-speed rail is being considered as the innovative surface mode of transportation. The official definition of high-speed rail is that those trains are able to run at the speed of 250 kilometers per hour or above. This is a definition from the Unions of International Railways definition. Now you can see from the maps, so there are actually quite a few countries has already developed a high-speed rail system, including China, Japan, France, Germany, Italy, and Spain. In the US, there is a so-called high-speed rail. You probably know about this. It's actually called Acela Express, serving the DC via New York to Boston. I said it's so-called because it can run a top speed of 150 miles per hour, but only for 8 minutes in part of the north of the New York and Rhode Island areas. Apparently, there is a lot of consideration in terms of their infrastructure is aging, so that cannot reach the top speed. Many other countries, including again the U.S., Singapore, Malaysia, India, Austria, and so on, they also either in the process of planning or in the process of construction of high-speed rail. Just to give you a background here in the States, now there are currently, as you may heard about, the California high-speed rail system, which has been developed for almost a decade. But still, they are trying to building the line connecting with the Bakersfield to the Merced in the Central Valley in California. In addition, there is a new high-speed rail line, which was led by a private company called the Bright Line West. They're connecting Las Vegas to LA. They expected to build in the middle of the medians of the highway. The expectation is to complete the projects by the 2028, which is the Los Angeles Olympic Games. So we're not sure if that's going to come true, but as you see, there's a lot of attention on that. On the southern part in Texas, you may heard about also there has been a huge efforts of developing a high-speed rail connecting with Dallas and Houston, and but obviously that project has experienced some disruptions due to various type of political consideration, economic consideration, and the local oppositions as well. So yeah, so all what I'm trying to say is that clearly this is not a cheap project. This is involving with a massive investment, which means that it needs a careful considerations in terms of their planning, their impacts, and so on. Now, yes.
Sorry, I think for Brian just mentioned I think they have a Y in Florida as well.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah.
It's not technically high speed.
Okay, gotcha.
Exactly, yes.
Sorry.
So the Florida one was called the Bright Line. Yes, you're right. It's connected Miami's to Orlando, but it's running on the diesel train.
Okay.
The speed is about 80 miles per hour. So according to the definition, it's really not considered as a high speed. And another major issue of that line is that they are running on existing tracks system, which means there's still a cross road, and so it does not allow the trains to running at a really true high speed. Anyway, yeah, so this diagram basically shows to you the kind of global trend of high-speed rail evolutions globally. So you can clearly see that since the 1964, when Japan launched the first bullet trains, many countries has started developing their own technologies, including Europe and France. Now, what you see is started in 2008, and after this evolution of high speed will really start to take off. And one of the major reason was because, again, China has launched a massive high-speed development plans. I'll talk about that further later on. Now, some of you may be curious about, well, seems like a high-speed rail is so attractive, but why China decided to develop high-speed rail? And what's the reason behind that? Well, I'd like to tell people about the reason behind that using this diagram. So you can see this is a simple diagram showing to you the world's largest migrations. Now, clearly, China has the huge population with 1.4 billion people. And also in China, there is huge migrations, typically around travel peak seasons. For those of you who have come from China, you know, usually those are referred to like the Chinese New Year, equivalent to the Christmas breaks, or during those peak travel seasons like the Labor Days or like the national holidays, which are equivalent to maybe Thanksgiving or so on. So you can see those inter-regional sort of travel mobility demand is huge. But the conventional rail really couldn't meet those demands. So that's why, so there's a huge demand. So this is similar to many other countries as we have seen. Now here, this is a picture, again, was taken in 2014. So it was taken at a train station called Guangzhou in the southern part of China. So again, this was during the travel peak seasons, which called the spring, travel period. What you can see is at the station, it's full of people, and there's also military has to step in to make the order so that people are able to aboard the train. So I don't know how many of you have experienced that, but when I was a kid, I have experienced all about the situation. It's hard to get the train ticket back home even during that peak season. So it's really hard. Now, another thing to look into this is about why China developed the high-speed rail is because there is a huge imbalance of travel demand, which you can see still from the picture. The size of China is equivalent to the US, but you can see the population is distributed quite unevenly. Most of the people are distributed, in the coastal areas where there's a better jobs opportunity, economic opportunities. But usually after the spring breaks, before the Chinese spring New Year's, people are actually tend to actually travel from those developed regions to the less developed region, where is their hometown. So those left side of the figure shows those are the migrations, typically from this developed regions to the less developed hinterland. But after the holiday, usually it will see a huge increase of the demand that coming back. So from those less developed region in the west, southwest, and northeastern part to those developed regions. So such a kind of unbalanced demand has created huge burdens for the existing transportation networks. So this is why, obviously, the biggest motivations why China decided to choose high-speed rail instead of developing, highways or aviation, simply because high-speed rail has the huge capacities to accommodate such a huge demand. Now, this is a kind of diagram just illustrating the networks, how this network looks like. So you can see basically now the high-speed rail has already connected all the major cities. It is being reported that for cities with 500,000 people or above, they have all connected, by high-speed rail system. Now, how China developed this system in such a relatively efficient and short time period. I say this is because, again, if you think about this, it started in 2008 when they launched the first line, and until now, almost 10, 15 years or so, they have already developed almost about 45,000 kilometers of high-speed rail. So how did they did that? Basically, I characterized this into the four major phases. Now, for those of you who are not familiar with China, so unlike the US political system, the China is actually a centralized government system. So major, transportation planning was conducted at the central government level. State and local government plays complementary roles to provide a support in terms of land use, station planning, and so on. So this diagram basically shows to you, originally started in 2004, they launched this initial plan. At that time, the goal was to develop the tracks of high-speed rail at 12,000 kilometers by the years of 2020. But clearly, as we can see, the speed of development was so rapid that even before the 2020, and they have already reached that goal. So in 2008, so they adjusted the plan. So further alleviated this total track length to 16,000. But again, in 2016, you can see that the plan has further been adjusted because the networks was expanded so rapidly, and so they moved to this plans of high-speed rail networks to the 38,000 kilometers. Now, the most recent plan was conducted in 2021. During which they actually further improved the plans to 70,000 kilometers. Okay, so now while we have seen this is a huge expansion, now you can definitely see from the actual operational standpoint of view, those infrastructure has made a huge changes, including not only the track length, but you can see the electrification rate and double track rate has further increases as well. This usually being considered as indicators to measure the service quality of this system. On the other hand, in terms of the travel demand, and you can clearly see a change that has happened. So here, this diagram shows to you the modal share changes of passenger transport in China for nearly half century. So you can see that in the 1960s at that timing. So rail used to be a dominant road. Simply the highway and aviation was not well developed. But in more recent years, started in the 1983s, 1990s, 2000, we can see that the share of the road transport started to increase dramatically. However, since 2000, since the launch of the high-speed rail, and you can see that mode shift has started to happen again, which means that the rail started to gain more riderships. And so they are substituting the highway. Also, obviously, aviation has also experienced expansion as well. So in terms of so what I have just described with you is this overall trend. Now, many of you may already feel, oh, it's quite impressive. Wow, how China was able to develop such a large system in such a rapid time. Well, clearly, the financing is a big consideration. These system obviously requires a large financial support and consistent support. So because China has these centralized government system, that actually facilitate the planning process and the financing as well. So this diagram basically illustrated the capital expenditures on Chinese railway infrastructures. So you can clearly see that the Chinese railway investment has been consistently remained at the level of the 81 billions to 100 billions US dollars annually for almost 2 decades. So can you imagine, comparing with, other countries, right? So the financial support behind these large infrastructure investment was enormous. Now, in addition to this financial support, now there's also important things to consider, which is in terms of the technologies development. Now, as you may know that, obviously, China was not the leading countries who originally developed these technologies. Those countries, including Japan, France, and Germany, right? So they usually developed to be considered as the frontiers, pioneers in terms of the high-speed rail technologies, innovation, development. However, what I wanted to show you here is that given that China has decided to develop a large infrastructure on high-speed rail, so they also developed a kind of systematic approaches for expanding their research and capacities, their technologies capacity, and their infrastructures and so capacity as well. So you can see these are basically summarize some of the government initiatives which focuses on how to providing financial support, but also providing support mechanisms to support research and development and to advance the railway technologies development. So this is why you can see now I basically characterize this development of the high-speed rail technologies into different phases. The initial stage was started in the 1980s to 2003. At that time, most of these technologies we consider as indigenous technologies. So they actually developed their own one, but those technologies are basically on the experiment stage, meaning that they are not feasible for massive adoptions. Now, the second phase is considered as the foreign technology acquisition. Now, one thing to note is that because China has a huge population and because it has a huge market, so that basically allows China has the bargaining powers with a lot of the countries, including Japan's and Germany and France, so they can basically try to acquire those technologies through a kind of arrangement that allows those technologies being transferred to China, and so that they can make some further innovations on top of that. So as you can see, that started in 2008 and onward, China started to make further innovations and adoptions of various types of technologies, including all these major high-speed rail technologies from Alstom, Bombardier, Kawasaki, and Siemens. Those are all these high-speed rail rolling stock and manufacturing companies. And they have so far developed their own rolling stocks, which has a capacity of running at the speed of 350 kilometers per hour and above. So you can see that's definitely a pretty massive, right? So now some other things to consider here, including some of the construction cost. Now, many of you may have seen the reports from the media. Well, we criticize in high-speed rail is so expensive to build, to be affordable in this country. But in the case of China, you can see probably a different story. Now, why is that? For example, you can see this table basically summarizes some of the developed high-speed rail corridors. We calculated the average construction cost on the unit level. So you can see the average cost ranges from the 3.7 million US dollars to 25 millions per kilometers. Okay, so this is a much cheaper compared with the cost in the US. And part of the reason was because of land acquisitions. Again, in the case of China, the land is a government owned, is a national government owned. So that actually has a big relieve of big burdens. Another one is about labor costs. So the labor cost is also relatively cheap. And the third reason was because of technologies, as I mentioned earlier. Unlike many countries who tend to directly borrow or acquire foreign technologies, China basically was able to localize their technologies and be able to customize and making these technologies be much more affordable based on their own kind of R&D capacities. So that actually has a huge impact of reduced cost. Now, in terms of the kind of speed of project delivery, and you can also see that it is quite impressive. We also know that in many countries, it is quite challenging to make the projects being delivered on time, on budget. In the case of China, and as you can see, the speed of those high-speed development ranges from 2 to 35 kilometers per month. So that's how you can see that for a large system, like, for example, the Beijing and Shanghai high-speed rail line, which is considered as one of the most profit line now in the world, has a distance about 1,300 kilometers, was developed only in 4 years. So that's kind of impressive aspects that you can see. Now, for those of you who have not been to China, so here I wanted just to give you some quick idea about how these high-speed rail looks like. So you can see from these pictures, so basically high-speed rail has a dedicated right-of-way. So which means that they are running on a dedicated tracks. So they're not shared with the freight. There's also no intersection. So that allows the train to run at a faster speed. They also usually has a very straight lines, so allows the train to run a faster speed. So you can see from the pictures on the top, so those are what we call the viaduct. So meaning that the trains are actually alleviated on top of the earth. This type of design also has some other advantages. For example, it reduced the environment interventions, allows, for example, animals and wild species could pass us through underneath, but also reduces the consumptions on the land as well, and also reduce the cost as well. Now, the other advantages of this type of design is if you see the third pictures below, they're usually based on modules. So each viaduct is actually made by these kind of big, bridges. And so they are based on the modularly based, again, because of the economy of scale, those can substantially, reduce the cost. So that makes the system be quite affordable. In some cases, high-speed rail will actually overpass a town, small cities. So clearly that reduces the environment concerns such as pollutions, noises, and so on. All right, so I spoke a little bit about the approaches of how China has developed their high-speed rail. Now let's look into some academic side of these topics. Now, if you're looking into the literatures, in fact, there has been a substantial increase in interest in the academic field, trying to investigating the social economic impact of high-speed rail. A couple of years ago, I actually did a bibliometric analysis, which I studied about 1,000 articles, research papers published in journals, peer-reviewed journals. But looking into, how does these studies have been distributed, what system they're evaluating, and what aspects they're trying to evaluate it. So this diagram, maybe you're hard to see that. It shows to you on the left-hand side, it shows to you the regional distribution or the country-specific focuses. So you can see here, this one shows to you, this is the study focused on China. And you can see there is topics focused on Europe, Finland, France, Germany, Japan as well. I think US there's a UK. So US has a relatively small amount of the study, although we have seen there are some increasing studies. coming up more recently. Now, on the right-hand side of the diagram, you can see those are the breakdown by topic areas. Those, again, including most of the study topics, including the modal comparison, such as comparing with the high-speed rail and aviations, compared with the cars, buses, and so on. So, such as a modal substitution and so on. There's also studies about development strategies, disruption impacts, economic development, employment impacts, housing impacts, network structures, and system operation, and so on. So overall, yeah, so there has been extensive studies already done in this area, but I have to say that while there has been extensive research in this area, and you can see that these approaches could vary a lot, which means that their results could be quite different from one another. So this is why we did a couple of additional follow-up studies. Again, this was primarily led by my PhD student, Zhenhua Chen, who has just recently graduated. So while we're looking into, well, for example, how different research methodologies may affect your assessment outcome. For example, if you're using different research methodologies, like the DID methods versus maybe a time series analysis, how would you lead to a different outcome? Or we look into, for example, more holistic approaches, understanding those impacts. Because again, when we look into the literatures, different authors and scholars, they tend to focus on specific indicators as the outcome measurement of their performances. Now, we're thinking about, well, is there like an overall or comprehensive assessment, such as a city attractiveness index, and to see how those impacts varies. And we do find out that there is some very interesting findings. Overall, this type of studies tends to really provide with the scholars a kind of a frameworks. So hopefully we can have a more systematic understanding of those impacts. Now, this diagram basically just to show you, I don't know whether you can see this clearly, but this is really trying to show you, well, how can we really understand this socio-economic impacts of those high-speed rail system? Now, obviously, you can apply these frameworks to many other mega projects. They are pretty much similar. No, so, for example, those would including land use impacts and real estate impacts. So when we study about those rail corridor development, a lot of the impacts could be due to land use changes. Will stimulate the housing prices increases, as we observed in the case of China. They could also affecting some of the land use transaction, land structure changes, and so on. Tourism is another big impact on also modal choices, change different modes of transportation, economic impacts, and environment impacts. Now, those are definitely important topics to look into. But what I want to also mention is that on the bottom of this diagram, and you probably couldn't see this, let me see if I can move this a little bit above here. So understanding these impacts is not obviously the goal, because eventually we wanted to thinking about how should we plan for the future. So this is why in this diagram in the button, you can see it has a keywords called forward-looking impact prediction, smart plan evaluation, facilitate investment decisions. So this is what my research team is currently focusing on, which means we're only looking into the past impacts. We're trying to hopefully using those kind of trend and patterns understand, we're trying to thinking about how should we plan for the future. Okay, so I will share with you some of the study that we have done, but due to limited time, so I'm going to be just focused on a few topics. Hopefully, we'll give you some big pictures. Now, the first one I'm going to quickly talk about, it was a study that we published a couple of years ago looking to land use, because I know there's a huge interest of the TOD and land use here at the center. So the land use impacts of high-speed rail is definitely going to be huge. But the question is, what will be the impacts and how would be the impacts varies by different type of city? Again, for the case of China, as I mentioned, there's a huge, different type of city. So we should expect the different impacts. Now, also another important thing to notice that a lot of these high-speed stations are actually been developed in the suburban areas or sometimes in rural areas. So you can see those get definitely going to affecting a lot of the land use, new applications. will stimulate the real estate development and so on. So there's also a very interesting phenomenon in the case of China. It is called high-speed rail new town. So I don't know how many of you have heard about this. So basically, this is a kind of residential kind of complex. Sometimes it's called the high park, scientific parks, but with a branding of high-speed rail in it. Simply because the real estate developer typically using this as a slogan and to attract the people to buy using easy accessibility kind of advantages of by nearing the station. So this diagram basically shows to you these spatial distribution of the so-called high-speed rail new town in China. So you can see nowadays it's nearly almost everywhere in the Chinese cities. So at the same time, as we have seen that as more cities started to develop the high-speed rail station and adding new services, this also created a huge concern about, well, does the land be used appropriately? Sometimes the real estate tend to buy those land and acquire this land without a proper use of the land. And sometimes you will see a phenomenon called the high-speed rail ghost town.
No, yeah.
Have you heard about that, Tara?
I've heard about that, and I've also seen ghost towns, like not just around like
Oh.
high-speed rail, but also like I think like in suburban areas as well. Like I think Suzhou is a very interesting example. Like if you've ever like been after Suzhou, if you ever drive
Yeah.
out to Suzhou to the airport, you can see all these like ghost towns.
Yes, exactly. So they call it ghost town simply because it's not because there's ghosts. It's simply because there's no people in there. They just build this high-rising residential places, but you can see that there's not many people there. So there's no transit, there's no school, no any kind of facility. So it's just nice, fancy, tall buildings, but nobody's just living there. A lot of this obviously was due to speculations. I mean, again, people think, well, if you have a high-speed station, people will automatically go there. But the reality is probably no. So this is why the government actually launched policies, some guide, trying to require to avoid excessive use of land for real estate development, particularly related to high-speed rail. But the question here again is, this is the background, but the question is, well, how much the impacts high-speed rail has on these land structure changes, okay? And how these impacts vary. Well, if we're thinking about the planning and the policies, well, how should we plan for these policies so that we can be more effectively curb these irrational development, right? So this study basically was conducted, so we used a large data set with 1.5 million records of land transaction data obtained for the period from 2007 to 2015. And we tried to compare with the cities with the high-speed rail and city without high-speed rail and try to see their patterns. So some of the key findings from the study, including, so first of all, we compared the high-speed rail with some other infrastructure like the highway and metro development, because these are also areas of major investment as well. And we find out the influence of high-speed rail on these land structure changes is much stronger than other modes. Now, just a footnote, when I say the land structure changes, it means within the city, how these land has been actually used. Is it to be more leads to a more mixed land use pattern, or is it needs to a more divergent or diverse or more concentrated on the certain type of land use? Okay, so that's the way how we basically define this. We also find out that in the tier 2 and tier 3 cities, so those are the cities usually has a population ranges from 5 million to less than 10 million people. Okay, so they consider it relatively more active in these kind of high-speed rail land use development. So certainly these studies provided some important implications for the future of land use policy as well as the station development. Now, here next, I want to just to quickly talk about another projects which I think might be also interested to the center here, since it's focused on equity. Now, we also studied about the equities impacts of about high-speed rail in China. Now, one of the biggest thing in the case of China is that normally people think about high-speed rail is a premium transportation services. because it's usually provide a higher speed and usually coming up with a higher fares. Okay, so if you're thinking about in the U.S., a Acela Express is considered as a more expensive train than the regional train. So you can see most of the people are businessmen who take the high-speed train. So there's certainly a concern in the case of China, simply because if we look into the diagram, and you can see a lot of the people actually, even though after they develop the high-speed rail, there is still a huge use of the conventional rail. So that's how you can see this line here is stagnated here. So this shows the path, the conventional rail. It's not reducing dramatically, but it's keep us constantly. Okay, so that's why you can see basically, even though there's high-speed rail been developed, it seems like still there's a majority, I mean, quite a lot of people using conventional rail. So we're trying to answer this question, well, what makes people still using conventional rail, even though high-speed rail is an option for them? So I did this studies with a collaboration with the colleagues in Chongqing, one of the big municipalities in China. We conducted a large survey with almost 5,000 respondents. So we did some mode choices survey or modeling and trying to understand their impacts. So some of the major findings, including clearly those kind of mode choices, including those social demographics, students, lower income people generally more prefer to use the conventional rail. So meaning that the price is still a concern to them. We also find out that some other people are not just aware of high-speed rail is available for their destination. This could be due to because a lot of the system was just launched, so they didn't know that system was available. So we provided some implications through this study, including topics such as we believe that while high-speed rail has been massively developed and deployed, it might still be important to maintain some level of the conventional rail, especially for less developed regions, simply because people may not value time much and they may be more sensitive to the price. So those could be still usable to them. Also, I think for the case of China, they may need to consider dealing with some dynamic pricing system so they basically allow the prices to fluctuate, which actually has been already implemented this year in some of the routes. So it's quite impressive to see them making the changes. All right, so I think we have limited some time, right? So I'm going to do a little bit quicker here for the rest of the one. Economic impact is also another important big topics when you're talking about the high-speed rail. And in fact, one of the biggest motivations for China to develop a high-speed rail is to promote a coordinated regional development, meaning that linking the developed regions with the less developed region so allow them to achieve a coordinated development pattern. So we did some studies to evaluate these topics, again, to see if that goal has really been achieved or not. So this is just some diagram illustrating, well, how does the regional economy in China actually been changed? So you can see, if you look into the diagram, you do see that during the 2000 to 2014, that period, the Chinese regional economy actually has started to become more converged, meaning that the less developed regions tend to catch up the developed region, meaning that there is a regional convergence. But does this also associate with the high-speed rail development? Or does high-speed rail really contribute to that? We're not sure. So that's why we did this type of study to evaluate that. Okay, so obviously this is a complex topic because it involves with different geographic level, and the result could be varies. So we did the studies at the different geographic level by comparing different developed zone. We also tried to develop the analysis using different research framework, using spatial econometric modeling, as well as using computable general equilibrium analysis. These are different research methods. And here, this is just a diagram illustrating how a railway investment could translate into some kind of economic impact. Now, due to the limit of time, again, I'm just quickly jump to the finding part. So although we used different data and that we conducted using different methodologies, we found out that the patterns is generally consistent. Less developed regions tend to grow relatively faster because of the improvement of the high-speed rail brought due to the accessibility improvement. We also find out these economic impact can be quite substantial Again, those could be because those impacts involving with not only the local impacts, but because also they have a lot of the spillover effects on adjacent areas. All right. Now, so far, I have just spoke about what has been happened from the ex post analysis framework, right? Now, what about the future? As a transportation planners, we always plan for the future. So the biggest question to ask is, what is the lesson learned? How should we do it for the future, right? Now, one of the biggest challenges now in the case of China, and you can see is while China has developed 450,000 kilometers of high-speed rail, right? And they're planning to build up to 70,000 kilometers by the 2030. Now, another biggest issue it's happening is because you can see the population in China has already reached the top, and there is predicted a huge population decline. Because again, it used to have a one-child policy. Now they're starting to see their population start to decline. Now, so you can see this is a dilemma. On one hand, you have a huge infrastructure expansion, but on the other hand, the population is shrinking, is declining. So will this be sustainable in the future? So that's basically the question that we have here for this study. In fact, if you look into more recent news media coverage, and you can see issues started to become more apparent and emerged. For example, I just depicted two very interesting news article, which they recently find out in a region called the Hainan province, right? So there is a high-speed rail station has been developed for 5 years with almost like 40 million yuan of investment. But the stations, since it's been developed, it has never been used. Okay, so that means the station has been developed, it's sitting there, no one's using that stations for 5 years. And the official response was because, well, if they use the station, well, they're gonna suffer a huge financial losses, operational losses. I mean, as a planner, I mean, you can ask the question, well, if that's the case, why do you plan at the beginning, right? So that seems like quite redundant. Yes.
I hope this is not a stupid question, but is Hainan like an island?
Yes.
And does that train station connect to the mainland?
Okay, that's a good question. So Hainan Island, basically, yes, it is an island, but there is actually a high-speed rail line. It's called the circle around the line. So they're mainly serving the island. But now they do have some kind of a train, but it's a conventional rail, not the high-speed train connecting to the mainland. Okay. So if you may say Hainan Island is a little bit isolated, but this year, if you look into the media, you can see they have actually found that there are more stations has not been used or has been closed, used it for a while, has been closed, even including some of the big cities like Nanjing or maybe some places. Yes, you can name, there's quite a few. Now the media find out that there are more than 20 high-speed stations remain idle, raising concerns about the efficiency of investment. So if we look into some countries, like for example, UK. Now, UK used to be the birthplaces of the railway, right? So if you look at their evolution pattern of their tracks, so you can see they experienced a rapid growth, which typically it's in the late of 19th century. It's called the railway mania. Okay, most of these railway development was driven by the private investment. So they reached the top about 30,000 kilometers. But since the 2040 and 50 and 60, there was a huge decline because of competitions from the automobile and aviation and so on. Now, in the US, and we can see some similar patterns. So we know that in the past, the US has a great passenger rail. So we call the golden age of the passenger rail travel, right? That usually started in the 1980s and then peaked in the 1920s, but started to decline since there's more highway and automobile being used and aviation and so on. So what you see here is this is the pattern that those developed countries has already experienced. Will China follow the same patterns? We don't know yet. So this is why we're trying to do this study, is to really examining, well, how does, yes, question.
Just one quick question on those two previous
Yes.
charts. Those are both passenger and freight combined in these?
Yes. So if you look into this, this is called the track length. Okay. So yes, those are both freight and passengers are combined. Okay. So in the US, if you look into the passenger rail, I mean, those are around the shared freight corridor nowadays, as you know. So this is basically reflected the scale of their infrastructure. Now,
we have similar challenges in the UK, the US, and China as a population decline.
no, well, it's not about a population decline. It's about the infrastructure development. So if you see the infrastructure development, this diagram is just to show you the track length of the rail system. Now, in the UK, if you see the diagram, they experienced a rapid growth, right, in the 19th centuries, in the early 20th century, but they experienced a huge decline because of, again, competitions from other modes, because of efficiencies issues. In the US, that's the similar pattern. Again, this is just trying to provide a background to showing, how these countries have experienced. Now, what you see China is experiencing, they're still going through that major rapid expansion. So, but are they going to reach the top? Are they going to experience a decline? So we're not sure. Yes.
I also like to add for UK. I think another reason why their rail service declined because Margaret Thatcher privatized the national rail service during the 1980s as well as privatizing. So,
Yes.
so that led to decline service way. I think there's also similar trends here in the US with Amtrak.
Well, thank you for mentioning that. Yes, there is actually in the 1960s, there is a very important policy. It's called the beaching cut. I don't know whether you heard about that. Beaching is the treasurer of the UK. And when he was in, I think when that prime minister was in office, because the UK railway was become so inefficient, they lost a lot of money and a lot of complaint, and so they're trying to minimize that. So a lot of the station and tracks was being abandoned. So in the 60s, so that's why you see a huge decline. I have another study I can show you next time. Okay. So it's another study during my sabbatical. I'm doing that study for the UK. But anyway, let's back to this here. So basically, this diagram just to show you, well, if you're looking now in the case of China, so how these high-speed rail systems varies across different cities, right? Now we're comparing big cities like New York. This is a small towns like a Mobile or something, right? So you can see, obviously, these cities vary substantially by population. But we also wanted to know, how about their high-speed rail infrastructure? How do they vary? So you can see, obviously, we call this Tier 1, Tier 2, Tier 3 cities, those based on the population variations. So Tier 1s are considered as the biggest cities with a population of over 10 million people or above. But Tier 2 is considered as a medium size and Tier 3 as a smaller one. So you do see that there's a huge variation of high-speed rail in terms of number of services being provided on a daily basis, total number of rail lines, number of stations, and the building areas of the stations. Now, so how can we really study about this kind of patterns? Now, we used a kind of important theory. It's called the urban scaling law. So I don't know if you have been familiar with this, but this is a kind of a theory originally from the physics, where they try to study about different objects or biologies, how these different organs is related to the size of the animals and so on. Now, obviously, recently the urban scientists have been using these theories to explain how our cities varies, how their socio-economic characteristics varies given to the size of the city in terms of measured by population. So typically, by using these kind of urban scaling theories, you will be able to estimate these is called a scaling parameter, which is called the beta coefficients. If this coefficient equals 1, that means you have a constant return to scale, such as, for example, the need for waters of resources, electricities. As you increase the population by hundreds, right? So the increase of these electricities and so on is going to also be increased by the same level. So that's why it's 1. For some areas, such as economic opportunities, innovation, and so on, those typically have a scaling parameter above 1, simply because for large cities, there's typically agglomeration effects. So you would expect as your population increase, the growth of your GDP is actually going to be more than the size of the population. Vice versa, if your city shrinks, and then you will see that the GDP's decline will probably be more than the size of the population. Now, for infrastructure, that is pretty interesting because generally speaking, study has typically find out the scaling parameter is below 1. The reason is because if your city is expanded, let's say by a certain level, the need of the infrastructure will be less than the equivalent level of the population increase. The reason is because, again, there is a kind of economy of scale, and there's a certain infrastructure can be shared, can be used. So the need will be no more than the same size as the population growth. So we used this theories to test, well, how does this apply to the case of China? So if you see this beta coefficients I estimated here, so we estimated population and with the different high-speed rail indicators. The overall model shows you these scaling parameters is below 1, which makes sense. But we do find some abnormal findings, especially at the different regional and city level. Particularly if you look into in the tier 1 cities and tier 2 cities in terms of their building areas, you can see that scaling parameter is way above 1. This typically indicates that the scale of those infrastructure in terms of the building areas is way large than the scale of the population. Again, if for those of you who have been to China, you may have seen this. A lot of these high-speed stations are built like airport terminals. They're huge. There are a lot of the open spaces. So in other words, their capacity is much larger than this actual needs from the demand. Okay, so same thing for the services for the tier 3 cities. We find out for those tier 3 cities, in fact, the high-speed rail has been offered more frequently than what their demand is. Again, this is based on just the average of outcome. So we did some additional kind of forecast by using some future population predictions and to see, well, given the future change of population, let's say among the Chinese cities, how the size of the high-speed rail infrastructure will look like. And we did some predictions. The result typically find out, well, some cities could allow some level of expansion, like those big cities, Shanghai, Beijing. It's reasonable to add maybe additional capacity for another station or so on. However, it's definitely going to be dangerous to add additional infrastructure, especially for those shrinking cities that observed in the northern part of China, for example, Harbin. If you look into their planning documents, there are still plans to have a further expansion. For cities like Wuhan or Shenzhen, those areas tend to be relatively at the median level, meaning that, well, there's no need to further either expand or cut the services in the future, given, again, the population changes. Certainly, again, these studies have certain limitations. Again, they are based on the single years. Again, they are also analyzing on the certain variable, so it needs some further exploration, and that's actually what we're working on right now to look into this more in a granular level using some better GIS data. But I think just to quickly summarize for this a series of study that I just presented to you, I feel there are a couple of lessons learned, both for the case of China and for other countries. Number one is we should notice that for major infrastructures like a high-speed rail or a major passenger rail route, the impacts of those systems tend to be long-term or widespread, which means that when we are trying to considering a planning for these systems, we needed to consider how can we really capture these wider social economic impacts instead of just simply looking into the ticket revenues or return to investment. And this is why also you can see in countries like the United Kingdom, they have been more advocating for measuring their impacts through a wider economic impact instead of looking into just a narrow direct impacts. Another lesson learned, I think, for the case of China, obviously is so China's success in high-speed rail development typically can be attributed to their strategic planning, a strong investment in research R&D, consistent government guidance. Also, this is including a lot of kind of development on the different sectors, promoting their robust technological and construction capacities. While some of the Chinese capacity cannot be learned due to the political or social demographic variations, I do believe that some of the lessons could be learned, especially because such as the technology's adoptions. While other countries has already developed the high-speed rail, it is quite important to expand research capability so that we can hopefully identify the most appropriate development models for a specific country. Thirdly, also, I think it's important to consider scientific and collaborative approaches for large infrastructure planning and policies. I say this is, again, because different countries has already developed different models. So definitely there's lessons learned that could be borrowed from other countries and regions. Collaborative efforts is still a key. I said this is because important, given we have a huge now tensions between the U.S. and China. A lot of the normal collaborations can be prohibited and be affected by politically. However, if we're really thinking about infrastructures, how can we really advance the infrastructure development? How can we really achieve those kind of collaborations? It still can be quite important. In fact, many other countries has greatly benefited from the collaborations. If you look into the case of Japan, for their development careers as well, they have all been benefited from the international collaborations. So I think that's definitely going to be important things to consider for the future. With that, I think I will just conclude here. I think this is probably my slides. Here are some references. If you're interested, there are 2 books about this topics. The left-hand side books was introducing some of the planning and the political context of high-speed development. On the right-hand side, just shows some of the empirical evaluation of the system. Okay, so let me stop here. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you.
Time for a few questions, if anyone has some, and if anyone who's joining us on Zoom has questions, you can drop them in the chat and I will relay them.
So I do have a question about Chinese high-speed railway. So of course, Chinese high-speed railway has gotten a lot of investment and support, and wondering, I'm just curious if there has been like a little pushback from the airline into other industry and how China's able to like placate them.
Well, that's a great question. In the case of China, well, it's probably quite different from the US.
Yeah.
Because again, the airlines are also state-owned
Yes.
companies. So when there is a central government plan, obviously those airline, will have no big objections. Even though there is a big changes happening
Yes.
in the case of China, because you can see a lot of the short-haul airlines
Yes.
has started to phase out.
Yeah.
For example, if you're familiar with the China's terrain, Chengdu and Chongqing used to be 2 big cities in the southwest part of China, and there used to be airlines services connecting these 2 cities with a rough distance about 500 or 400 kilometers away. So it's a very short, flight. And since the development of high-speed rail, those air services has been gone.
Yeah.
So I think from the transportation economic standpoint of view, it is actually basically a good thing because basically it makes your system be more efficient. So the airline can be more focused on their more competitive route. So that will leave the rooms for people to travel by train. So does that answer your question?
Yes, it does.
Yeah.
And I also have one last question about the Hainan, about the Hainan railway. So what I've heard so far right now, like the high-speed Hainan only like operates like around the island. So do you think if they can make use of these train stations if they actually connect to the mainland?
Right. Yeah, that's a good question. So there's some uniqueness of the Hainan. Number one is being considered as agriculture dominant areas, and there's some tourism in some cities. But the example I mentioned, it was something about some small village, a small town. So you can see again, even though there's a centralized government plan, but a lot of the local station planning are conducted at the local level. And some cities actually compete of having high-speed station being developed in their jurisdiction. So clearly there's still some irrational behaviors there, which leads to these type of outcome. Certainly, I think it will be important to have a more systematic research to understanding those impacts before these actual investment being conducted, because it's really a waste of the taxpayers' money. And now has becoming more and more covered by the media. So you can see that.
Send something in the chat. I don't know
Yeah.
if that was a
It's not a question.
Okay. Okay, good. Thank you.
Thank you so
Yeah.
much for
Yeah.
joining us.
Great.
Well, thank you. Yeah, so it's a nice to be here. Yeah, so yeah, looking forward to hear more from your centers and how we can do some perhaps collaborations.